Well, it's gardening season, and there's been a lot of talk about open pollinated versus hybrid versus heirloom versus GMO. What's the difference, and how can we know the difference? So, to understand a little bit more about the differences between these four different types of seed, I'm with Wendy Cook of Heartsong Produce.
Hi,
Thanks
John.
for being with us, Wendy.
Thank you.
So, Wendy, there's been a lot of confusion between heirloom versus open pollinated is kind of the first area that I'd kind of like to touch on. What can you tell us about open pollinated, and then about heirloom, and then maybe a little bit about the difference between the two?
Yeah, John, I get that a lot because I grow the heirlooms. People ask me, why heirlooms? Well, open pollinated is a term that has to do with the way a plant is pollinated. So there's even new varieties that are open pollinated. Heirlooms are open pollinated always. They can be pollinated through, wind, animals, insects, different things. But an heirloom specifically is something that has been handed down, over generations, whereas just directly open pollinated can be a new variety. So open pollinated are not always heirlooms, but heirlooms are always open pollinated.
Perfect. I like that. That's easy to remember. So tell us a little bit more about the open pollinated.
Yeah, the open pollinated, as I say, has to do with the method of pollination. The advantages of those are they're easy to pollinate, easy to produce, they're readily available on the market. They are viable true to type as long as they've not been contaminated. Commercial users will actually use some of the open pollinated varieties. Occasionally they'll find one that has mutated naturally. They call it a rogue, and they will pull that out of the bunch there. So.
A rogue, that sounds pretty intense. Like the seed is going rogue.
Not too bad. So.
Okay, switching over to the heirloom, why don't you tell us just a little bit more about that? We had a little brief overview of the open pollinated versus the heirloom. What can you tell us about the heirlooms more specifically?
Well, a lot of people are comparing nowadays the heirlooms to the hybrids, which we'll touch on in a minute. Let me explain to you a minute the difference between an heirloom and some of the other types. I mean, this is an heirloom. This is a family heirloom handed down generation after generation. It's special due to the history of it, due to the personal, feel of it. It's something personal. It's handed down. It's of value. This is a very useful item, mass-produced, economical. It's a big market item. It is produced for marketability. That's where so many seeds are. So that would be your difference. Both are containers, both will hold things, both are useful. But the heirloom tends to be the more valued thing because it's been handed down and the heritage and the history behind it.
Another thing that I've heard people claim before is that hybrid and GMO are basically the same thing. Now, maybe you want to explain a little bit about why maybe that isn't so.
Yeah, there is a lot of controversy out there nowadays regarding the GMO things, and it helps to understand the difference in terms. A hybrid is where a company or an individual has taken two parent plants, parent one, parent two, put them together to create desirable traits in a plant, and that equals your F1 hybrid. That's your first generation hybrid. So it is something that is deliberately created through other varieties in a controlled environment. However, some of your open pollinated plants that we mentioned earlier can naturally cross-pollinate and become a hybrid. On the other hand, some of the hybrids through selection over time can become stabilized and then be considered an open pollinated. But the hybrid term has to do with mixing the two seeds to create something with better qualities. GMO, on the other hand, it is not a natural process. It's done in a lab. Okay. And so it creates a whole new product. It is so unique that it is patented. You cannot save the seed. They own the intellectual rights to it. Right. We don't know with the GMO the long-term effects and things. So there's a lot of controversy out there.
So what can someone do if they're worried about potentially about maybe some health effects with GMO, or they're not sure? What can they do? What are some solutions for our viewers?
The thing you can do, you can buy single ingredient organic things. You can buy things that are labeled specifically non-GMO. There is no required labeling, but some companies are choosing to do that. You can grow your own food, obviously, or you can know your own farmer. So
get a hold of Wendy if you need some food and you don't have a spot for your own garden. And even if you do, she does deal with quite a variety, and by variety I mean variety of many of your different gardening staples. So you want to get a hold of Wendy here at Heartsong Produce for that. But that's what I say to people too. If you're really, really worried about it being organic or GMO or what have you, grow your own. And there's things that even if you live in an apartment, if you have a south-facing window, you might even be able to start just a little bit in your window there. It's warm there. You've got sunlight if you water it. And also another alternative for you out there is sprouting. Sprouting is very inexpensive. You can buy maybe a whole pound of broccoli seed on Amazon for $15. Get a sprouter set up for another $15, $30, you're on your way. So that's very inexpensive compared to buying the whole head like in a grocery store. But there's really room for all approaches: gardening, buying from Wendy, and sprouting your own and growing your own.
As far as the heirlooms, touching base back on that again, people say, why heirlooms? Okay, they don't care if it's a hybrid. They want something produces a lot of tomatoes, or people that do the market produce like I do, they want, uniform, perfect looking things. But again, the main reason for growing heirlooms is taste. I will tell you a little story. We had a guy this summer come to my produce stand, and he kind of frowned at my tomatoes, and I told him, ask him if he was interested. No, the tomatoes have no taste this year. And I was like, really? Okay. So I asked him, I said, let me let you try one. So I took a tomato to he and his wife, and they both bit into the tomato and looked at each other and they're like, that's pretty good. And they thanked me and drove off. Okay. I didn't know if I'd made much of an impression. A few minutes later, they come back and they wanted to buy some for supper. In the next day or two, they called me, and how much would I charge for 20 pounds? Because apparently the heirlooms do have a great deal more taste, but you also get such a variety of textures and colors and shapes. The biggest thing too is the history behind them. It's so neat to have this historical connection to your gardening, and there's a story. Most of these have stories behind them, and when you research where they came from or what they went through to get to us, some of the seeds that are now available from Iraq and stuff, now they've actually stopped some of the seed saving in Iraq. Anything you have from there is going to be valuable and rare and something you want to hang on to. To me, like I said, it's the family treasure. There's more to it than just the run-of-the-mill seed. You sacrifice flavor when you go to the hybrids. You can still find seeds by researching and trying different things, which I love to do. There are all kinds of varieties. You can get some that are early. You can get some that are productive. You can get some that are huge. There's just no end. The whole variety of what's available is just amazing.
Well, and as we mentioned earlier, with the open pollinated and the heirloom, those both can be harvested. The seeds can be harvested and replanted from year to year. So that is an advantage over the GMO, which is patented. You're not allowed to reseed those. And also the hybrid, if you try to plant a hybrid, it's either going to be sterile or it's not going to produce true to type. You're not going to get the same tomato that you got last year, if you get anything at all. So from a preparedness standpoint, you would either want to go with open pollinated or the heirloom, because if you happen to be without seed, and I highly recommend that you have extra seed on hand just in case. It's not that expensive, guys, but you can always save those seeds if it looks like you're in for the long haul and you need to be able to put something in the ground. So,
well, and John, I also might want to mention too that when you have the hybrids or the GMOs that a seed company owns, the control over what you grow then goes to the company, and you don't have the say over that. You don't have the control. When you're able to save seed, you have the say over what you're growing. And I might add too that if you're going to save seed, there's certain protocols of spacing and isolation to make sure that you're getting the pure seed. It's not hard to do. There are some plants like beans, tomatoes, peppers that are basically self-pollinated. They can cross-pollinate, but they easily are self-pollinating. They have the stigma and the pollen within the same flower, and they don't require, pollinators to be pollinated. So those are always nice to have.